Saw was released in 2004, is directed by James Wan and stars Lee Winnell, Cary Elwes, Danny Glover, Tobin Bell and a few other people as well, and is the movie that started a brand new trend in horror movies. That trend being torture porn. Whether that's a good trend or a bad trend, I'll let you decide. As some of you already know, the reason I'm reviewing this movie is because I asked you guys on Twitter which movie I should review for Halloween, and obviously Saw won the poll, so hence why I'm reviewing it today. And I've got to be honest, I'm really excited to talk about this film, because Saw as a franchise is one that I've always found interesting and fascinating, but I've never actually taken the time out to properly delve into it. So, yeah, I was really excited to see what all the hype was about, especially considering me watching Saw for this review was the first time I was ever watching this film. So, you are getting a completely fresh, take on this movie. This isn't a movie I've seen many times before. What you get in this review is literally my thoughts on seeing it for the first time, and I've got to say, I was pleasantly surprised, because this movie is a lot more restrained than I thought it would be. Well, at least compared to the sequels anyway. If anything, this movie plays out more like a thriller than it does a horror movie, and that's one of the best things I can say about this film. As I was watching it, the one thing that constantly went through my mind is that this feels and looks like a low-budget version of David Fincher's Seven. And I was just loving every single minute of it. The tone, the aesthetic, the style of it really does work for the sake of the movie. And the fact that it is choosing something like David Fincher's Seven as the main style and tone pretty much works hand in hand with what the movie is trying to do, with some of its more intense, horror-driven moments. The direction by James Wan is also really good as well. There are some moments in this movie where he really manages to get the most tension out of such a really simple scene, and I really love that about this movie. Also, the music is bloody brilliant as well. I can't remember the composer's name, but I'm pretty sure he stayed to do the music for every single Saw movie after this, as well as this one. And it's just really iconic at this point, especially the famous Hello Zepp song that plays near the end of the movie. It's just a really good score and works for the sake of the movie as well. The acting in this movie, for the most part, is good. But that being said, there are some genuinely terrible bits of acting in this film. Cary Elwes is pretty good in the film as Dr. Lawrence Gordon, not Gordon Lawrence. Yeah, he's pretty good. And it's quite interesting to see him in a movie like this, because my entire life, have always known him for being in comedy films, whether it be Liar Liar, The Princess Bride, or even Robin Hood Men in Tights, which is a fucking classic.
Good people, who have travelled from villages near and far, lend me your ears. That's disgusting.
Yeah, I've always seen him as a comedy actor, so to see him in something like this is very interesting, and for the most part he does work really well. There are a few points where he is very over the top, shall we say. But yeah, so as I said, when the moment calls for it, he really does deliver. I have trouble saying the same about Lee Winnell though, because he plays Adam, who is the other person trapped in the bathroom with Dr. Gordon. And his performance is very over the place. For the first half of the movie, I really didn't like the character of Adam because he was so frustrating, I guess. Like, you can tell that you have these two characters in this same place because they are the polar opposite of each other. You have Dr. Gordon, who's very, controlled and will try and, it's just very calm and will think of a way around this. And then you have Adam, who just screams all the time and shouts, and has some of the most annoying dialogue I've ever heard in a film. I shit you not. Like, some of the lines he's given, especially at the start of the movie, are just really stupid.
What's your name?
My name is very fucking confused. What's your name?
You know what, actually? His whining reminds me of something.
What's your name?
Stop ganging up on me! It doesn't matter!
So yeah, Cary Elwes is really good, if a little bit over the top at times, and Lee Winnell tries as Adam, but you can kind of better tell that his forte is more in writing than it is in acting. Well, at least in this first Saw movie anyway, because funnily enough, Lee Winnell actually wrote the movie as well, alongside James Wan, and you can, like I said, you can tell he's better off writing than he is acting, especially here anyway, because the story in this film really does take some interesting turns, and like I said, the fact that it goes for a more thriller, crime-oriented approach rather than just a straight-up slasher horror movie with lots of gore and shit really helps the story progress a lot more. And there's one device that this movie uses quite a lot, which actually is pretty effective for this film as well, is flashbacks. It uses a lot of flashbacks to fill in the gaps and tell its story as interestingly as possible, and I suppose you could say in a more non-linear way. And here it works quite well. Yeah, there are a couple of times where the flashbacks do get a bit, stupid, and you see like the same shot about 3 times in the space of 5 minutes. But that being said, from what I've heard, this is nowhere near as bad as the later movies, because this movie uses flashbacks in a sparing way to tell its story properly and fully. The later movies, literally every 5 minutes, as far as I'm aware, just kind of go, here's a flashback, and here's another flashback, and here's another, and another, and another, and another. Kind of goes a bit overkill, if you ask me. Also, one thing I have to applaud this movie for is what it is able to accomplish on such a low budget. I can't remember exactly how much they made this movie for, but it really wasn't that much. And you can tell in a few places, like there's this... I'm going to be honest, there's this really shit-looking car chase near the end of the movie, which looks so bad. But there are other aspects of the movie that really utilise the budget in the best possible way they can, and you can tell that James Wan and Lee Winnell were trying to find the best ways around the budget as possible, especially when in regards to filming certain scenes. Like there's one scene in particular which I think is really well handled, where Detective Singh is chasing this guy who they think is the Jigsaw killer, and spoiler alert, Detective Singh dies. But it's not particularly graphic, or at least, not compared to the later Saw movies anyway. But the way they go around shooting that scene is really interesting. You hear the gunshot go off. You see some of the blood, but you don't see how his head is until a few shots later when you see some photos of his dead body. But the initial impact of the shotguns hitting Detective Singh in the head, you don't see the full-on explosion of his head. You just see the blood trickling down his suit and then the body hit the floor. But you never see how graphic, the head looks. You just see the bottom half of, just below the neck. And that's really effective. And there's other shots in the movie as well where you can tell they're trying to cut corners because of the budget. Like, they're not filming something specific because they don't have the budget to make it look as convincing as possible. But it's those things that make this movie a lot more interesting on multiple rewatches, because you can really start to tell how they are trying to use such a limited resources and such a limited budget to their advantage rather than it being a disadvantage. By the way, for many years I thought this thing was called Jigsaw, but now I obviously realise that Jigsaw is in fact just some miserable old bloke who has cancer, and this thing is actually called Billy the Puppet. Really? It's called Billy. That I mean, no offense, but that's the least scary name you could give something that looks like that. That's like calling Chucky something like, I don't know, Bob. It doesn't sound as scary. Now, even though this movie is pretty groundbreaking in regards to what it inspired in the horror genre from this point onwards, I don't think it's a perfect movie. I mean, like I said, some of the acting in a few places is a bit iffy, so to speak. But there is one other aspect of the movie that I don't think works in its favour. And again, this is probably a budgetary thing or something, but the editing really doesn't help it. There are some points where the editing really works. Like when you see the first ever trap that kills a person in the movie, you see the famous editing style that was utilised throughout most of the Saw franchise, which is this really sped up, chaotic editing style to make it look more intense and graphic than it really is. And it works at points in this film. At the end of the day, it still looks like the deleted scene of a Marilyn Manson music video, but it works for some of these. But there are other points where that fast editing style really doesn't work. Case in point, that car chase again at the end of the movie. It's literally just a static car on a black background with some fog, and it's literally just sped up to make it look more intense. But unfortunately, it's quite funny. Not gonna lie, it's unintentionally hilarious, and it kind of took me out of the moment a bit as well. And there's a few other points where the editing or just something in the film doesn't quite work and makes it look more dated than it really is, because that's another thing about this film. It came out in 2004, but it looks like a film that came out in the late 90s, especially in regards to how it's edited and how it looks and how it's shot. Again, I applaud them for what they were able to do on such a low budget, but I don't know, the movie looks a bit older than it actually is. And that might be to do with how it was filmed, what cameras they used, and again how it was edited. But there's just a few things in this movie that really date it more than it really should have, which is a shame. And of course, I can't talk about Saw without mentioning that iconic twist towards the end. I mean, it's just brilliant. It's not one of the most ingenious plot twists I've ever seen in a movie, but it is still, especially for impact-wise, it is still very bloody effective. The way you have Tobin Bell just just standing up in the middle of the room, walking out that door, closing it, and obviously Lee Winnell's iconic shot of him just screaming is just it is a perfect way to end this movie. And to be honest, I would have been absolutely fine if they just left it at this film and not made any sequels, because it kind of works as its own self-contained thing. Which, I'll make that up to you, whether you think it's better or worse, whether they, carry the story on. But yeah, it just works so well as its own contained thing. And the way it starts and the way it ends is just so, I don't know, it just bookends and just so well. Also, can I just say that initial premise that the movie opens with, two people stuck in a bathroom chained to these pipes by their feet with no recollection of how they got there, is one of the simplest but also best premises I've heard for a horror thriller in a long time. And the way it's executed at the start of the movie really is really bloody effective and works really well. That's such a simple premise, and one that's kind of overused to death nowadays. You know, that kind of somebody stuck in a place, they don't know how they got there, and they're just left to figure it out. It's kind of overused now, but back then it was just a really effective yet simplistic setup for a story. In the end, I'm going to give Saw a 7 out of 10. It's a very interesting and entertaining horror thriller hybrid that still works quite effectively watching it back today, but unfortunately some aspects like the editing and the cinematography in a few places do date it more than it really should be, and also the acting is a bit iffy in places. Besides from that though, I can see why a lot of people really like this movie. I can kind of also understand the negative reviews when it initially came out as well though. It's not a perfect movie, but I can see how it carried on this trend into the near future for horror movies. Again, whether that's a good or a bad thing, I'll let you decide. So guys, that was my review of Saw. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked the video, then give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Bye.